Good evening. If you want to head on over to Jonah chapter 1, we'll be there for a bit, and then we'll be heading on out from there to two other stories. And tonight we're just going to be doing kind of a whole character study, 3 different people, 3 different stories, and then how they're all the same story, and then how they kind of talk to each other, and through that comparison we learn a little bit, and we can apply it to ourselves. And this one wasn't like in prep, but kind of like Chuck did a lesson of it's celebrating the decision Mike made to follow Jesus this week, and this wasn't with that in mind, but it kind of goes along with that too, and it's just made for such a wonderful week, because just thinking about Mike, and if you haven't gotten to meet him yet, he's just the sweetest gentle giant ever. So just a sweet guy. And then the spiritual genealogy that like Chuck had lined out this morning was so cool because, it's true. And then in that, you're looking at it and you think about how it all came to this moment where this Wednesday and Mike decided to commit his life to Jesus. And you're like, well, who did that? Was it all those people, or was it all Mike? And then the alternative as well is people are like, oh, it was all the work of the Lord. You had no part in it. But it's ask if it was one or the other. The answer is yes. It's the fusion of the two. And that's what we are. We are the people where God is working in and through his creation. And in fact, that doesn't take away from our autonomy, our individualness, but it actually makes us more of what we're supposed to be when we commit and follow him and listen to his word. That's kind of what we're going to be going into tonight as well. Is because, well, first we're going to read about a story about this man named Jonah. And I did a lesson on Jonah a while back. And we'll kind of hit on the same points here as well. But this is a story of someone who did not want to listen to the word of the Lord. And that gets him, it gets him up to his neck in trouble, sinking into the waters. But if you will look down into the book of Jonah, if you're there, in Jonah chapter 1, and we're just going to kind of summarize this first chapter. We're just going to look at the details of the story and move on from there. But Jonah, it starts in verse 1 that the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, "Arise, go to Nineveh, the great city, and call out against it, for its evil has come up before me," or before my face, literally. And Jonah, it says, he arose and he fled to Tarshish, away from the face of Yahweh. And he went down to Joppa, found a ship which was going to Tarshish, and he paid its fare. And then he went down into it, going with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of Yahweh. And then hop down to verse 5. The sailors, there was a storm that blew up, and the sailors became fearful, and they cried out each to his god, and they hurled the cargo from the ship into the sea to lighten the load for them. But Jonah had gone down below into the innermost part of the vessel, and had laid down, and had fallen into a deep sleep. So Jonah, this story is using hugely exaggerated reactions. Jonah at one moment he's greatly fearful and greatly angry and greatly happy, and it's it keeps using these great words to describe his reaction to things, and he just greatly needs to go to an ancient therapist or something because he's just all over the place emotionally. And Jonah, he hears the word of the Lord, and it doesn't even say why, but it just says he gets up and he goes the opposite direction. To say he was going to Nineveh is essential to saying he was going to Timbuktu. This is as far away as you can get from the direction of Nineveh. Nineveh is up and to the right. And Tarshish is down and to the left. That's on a map. Modern day Nineveh would be kind of in the region of Portugal. This is, and past Portugal, what do you got? Atlantic Ocean. Nothing. An entire body of water you're never going to cross. And no one crosses for thousands of years. And so then you've got Jonah now being rebellious against the word of the Lord, and he goes away, and not only does he go away, but he also goes down, like I said, down and to the left. Because he goes, did you catch the repetition? I was emphasizing it, but he goes down to Joppa. He went down into the innermost part of the vessel. He laid down, and then he'd fallen into a deep sleep. And so Jonah here, the one who was called to hear the word of the Lord, and then to speak it to the people, goes away and down from where he was supposed to. And so then what happens? But a storm arises. Now, why is that storm there? I didn't read the verse, but look back to verse 4. Yahweh hurled a great wind on the sea, and there was a great storm on the sea, so that the ship, it gave thought to breaking apart. Why is that storm there? It's actually a direct result of the actions of Jonah. God's actually trying to bring back his resistant prophet. He's trying to call him back. So he's sending this storm of trouble, and it's causing the ship to start to break apart and break into the storm. And you know what's funny is, who's the one who should be most aware of what God is doing in this story? Probably the prophet. You know, the prophet of God should probably be the one who's communicating the word of the Lord and understands it. But who's the ones who are awake and aware in this storm of what's going on? They're aware that this is like a not normal storm. It's the sailors. Like, they're the ones who are like crying out to all these different gods, and they're trying to wake up Jonah and say, call out to your God. Maybe we won't perish. And then who's the one God of all the people that they worship on this ship, all the different gods they could worship, who's the one God that could actually do something? Jonah's God. And what's Jonah doing? He's asleep at the wheel. Like he's down in the bottom of the boat, deeply fast asleep. And so Jonah, he comes up with this great solution to calm the storm. Instead of going and doing the word of the Lord and going to Nineveh, he decides instead he's going to be thrown into the sea. Tells them to do that. And so Jonah, he's cast into the ocean. And this is really curious, because I wanted to make this note as well about like how this storm is there, how God sends this wind upon the waters. There's a few verses noted here, but I want to specifically go to Psalm 18 really fast. If you want to put your finger in Jonah and turn over to Psalm 18, just read a few verses there. All the other poems quoted there, Psalm 29, Psalm 104, they all essentially say a very similar thing to what we're about to read. But God is pictured very often as like the one, like when his presence descends on Sinai, what does it look like? It's like a great storm cloud of fire and wind and cloud and storm and thunder. And then whenever you read here, David's meditating on God coming to his rescue here in Psalm 18. Look how he describes the rescue. It says, let's start in verse 4. It says, the cords of death encompass me, and the torrents of violence terrify me. The cords of Sheol surround me, and the snares of death confront me. In my distress I called upon Yahweh, and I cried to my God for help, and he heard my voice out of his temple. And my cry for help came before his ears. The earth shook and quaked. The fountains of the mountains were trembling and were shaken because he was angry. Smoke went up from out of his nostrils, and fire from his mouth devoured. Coals were kindled by it. He bowed the heavens, and he came down with thick darkness under his feet. He rode upon a cherub, and he flew. He sped upon the wings of the wind. He made darkness his hiding place, and his canopy around him. From darkness of waters, thick clouds of the skies, from the brightness before him he passed his thick clouds, hailstones, coals, and fire. Yahweh also thundered in the heavens. The Most High gave forth his voice, hailstones, coals of fire. He sent out his arrows, he scattered them, lightning flashes in abundance, and he threw them into a confusion. So one thing I want to note about this is God being this, like his presence is like a storm. This is actually doing a little bit of like ancient trash talk, right? So whenever you think of another false god that Israel always had a problem with, like what's the name of that god that comes to mind? Baal, right? The false god Baal. And Baal was a storm god. And there's actually, they've uncovered poems and songs from that time and the other nations that worship Baal, where they are singing praises to Baal, and it kind of sounds like a description of him being like riding on the clouds and controlling the wind and bringing the rain for harvest. And this, the way David's writing this poem is like, no, Baal doesn't do that. That's a false god. He's not the one who does that. You know who actually is the god of the storm, the one who actually controls these things? It's Yahweh, God Most High. And so this picture of God being the God of the storm, the one who sends the storm to call back his prophet, to create the circumstances where he could turn the boat around, repent, as we might say. But yet he decides to be cast into the sea. And as Jonah sinks down into the waters and it seems like it's the end, no, it gets much worse. In fact, there's a fish that swallows him up and drags him all the way to the very depths of Sheol. Because if you turn over now, back in Jonah, if you will, go to Jonah chapter 2. And I think you'll notice a little similarities between that poem that we just read of David, Psalm 18, and the poem that Jonah now crafts in the belly of this fish. Because what else would you do when you're stuck in the belly of a fish for 3 days at the bottom of the ocean? You craft ancient poetry. That's what you do. A word of advice if you ever find yourself there. But in Jonah chapter 2 and in verse 2, it says, Jonah speaking from the stomach of the fish, and he says, I called out in my distress to Yahweh, and he answered me. I cried for help from the belly of Sheol, and you heard my voice. For you have cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas. The currents surround me, the breakers and the waves, they pass over me. So I said, I have been driven away from your sight. Nevertheless, I will look again toward your holy temple. Water encompassed me to my very soul. The great deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped around my head. I went down to the base of the mountain. The earth with its bars closed behind me forever. But you have brought up my life from the pit, O Yahweh my God. While my soul was fainting within me, I remembered, Yahweh, my prayer came to you, to your holy temple. And what is God's answer to this cry from his prophet? Then verse 10, then Yahweh spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah up onto the dry land. There you go. The word of the Lord involves vomiting as well. This is a very strange and very humorous book when you really kind of think about it. But God speaks to this fish. And you know what? A fish is going to vomit quicker than the prophet of God is going to take the word of the Lord to Nineveh. But just like everything else in the story, except the prophet, it listens to the voice of the Lord. And the fish spits up Jonah on the dry ground, and he stands and he goes to Nineveh. And we're going to stop it there on your own time. Read chapters 3 and 4. It's an essential part of the rest of read it all the way to the end. Don't stop at the end of chapter 3. The good stuff's in chapter 4. But I want to stop right there with what Jonah does. This pattern of being out on the waters, a storm comes up, and why is that storm there? It's because of his own foolish actions and decisions. God sends that storm. What does Jonah do in the midst of that storm? Cries out to God. And what does God do? God rescues him, because that's what he does. But now let's keep moving on to our next story and our next example. Go to Matthew chapter 14. Matthew chapter 14. And here we're jumping right into the life and the ministry of Jesus of Nazareth. And one of his disciples has this very significant moment where they're told by Jesus to get into a boat and go to the other side of the sea. Look in your Bibles at Matthew chapter 14 and verse 22. This is right after Jesus fed the 5,000. One of the only stories that's in all of the Gospels, by the way, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The feeding of the 5,000, besides, of course, the death and the resurrection of Jesus. And then right after that is he immediately, this is verse 22 of Matthew chapter 14, immediately he made the disciples get into the boat, go ahead of him to the other side, and he sent the crowds away. So first off, they're told by the Lord to get in the boat and to cross the sea. Kind of a distinction from Jonah, that Jonah wasn't supposed to get in the boat and try to cross the sea. These disciples, they were told by him to go across the sea. So at the word of Jesus, they do go. But what happens? But a storm blows up. In verse 23, start reading again. And after he had sent the crowds away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. And when it was evening, he was there alone. But the boat was already many stadia away from the land, being battered by the waves, for the wind was against them. And then in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea. This is just, this is one of those stories where it's almost like once you kind of get the picture, it's almost laughable to say that, well, here's something that like people who are critical of the Bible, they'll say that there was kind of this development. As Christianity grew, Jesus more and more became like a God figure. At the beginning, he was just a good prophet. So as the history went along, people, and further from the actual events, people started to say he was more like he was God in the flesh. Like this is just one of those moments where that's not the case. Like the earliest gospel we have is Mark, and Mark records this story about the actions in the life of Jesus. And there is no clearer way that you could paint him as the embodiment of Yahweh God than to say that he has control over the wind and the waves. Because what did we just see? with all those, well, I didn't go to all of them, but all those passages in the Psalms, and I could go through like multiple stories where God splits the waters of the Red Sea, or in creation when he speaks a word and then light shines in the darkness and dry land comes up from the waters. This is Yahweh embodied that we're talking about here. Because what does he do when there's a storm, the wind, and the waves? He just walks right on across it. And in fact, it's kind of funny, in Mark's gospel, it says that he came to them walking on the sea, and it said it like he intended to pass them by. So it was kind of like he was walking, and he was just going to be like, hey guys, and then just like keep going along to the other, and I'll meet you on the other side. But what does he do here whenever they see him walking on the sea, as one does in the middle of the night? If you see a humanoid figure walking in the darkness on waters when it's not supposed to be there, what do they think of that? So look at verse 26. When the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, and they said, it's a ghost, and they cried out in fear. But Jesus spoke to them. He said, take courage. It is I. Do not be afraid. Again, one of those moments where the divinity of Jesus is just being painted in a story form. Because that phrase, take courage, it is I, literally, if you could I've seen it done. Again, I don't know Greek. Ask LA about it. And I've heard other people who've studied Greek say this as well. But that phrase, it is I, is just the phrase, I am. He says, take courage, I am. Don't be afraid. Come on now. That's good stuff. So as he's walking on the water, he proclaims that he is the I am. And then one of the disciples, one of the apostles, as Chuck mentioned this morning, that was in our Bible class in there. We were talking about kind of one of the more outspoken and bold apostles, the man by the name of Peter. He said to him, this is verse 28, he says, Lord, if it's you, command me to come out to you on the water. And Jesus says, come. And then getting out of the boat, Peter walked on the water and came towards Jesus. So just like in the case with Jonah, they're on the sea, crossing it in the waters. A storm blows up, and Jesus comes to them on the water, kind of like how God is the one who sent that storm to Jonah on those waters. But why is that storm there? Like, to ask that same question, why is it there? It just is. The terror and the fear that this storm's causing them, it's just there. There's no sort of, and God sent the storm upon the water. Sometimes there are just storms. And so then, what does Peter do? But he has to step out onto those waters in the midst of that storm and meet his Lord out there. And if you notice, something very similar happens in the case of Jonah and in the case of Peter. Because when he steps out onto the water, it says he started walking towards Jesus, but verse 30, what happens? It says, but seeing the wind, he became frightened, and beginning to seek, he cried out, saying, Lord, save me. Because in the book of Jonah, there's this kind of humorous moment where the sailors, they ask him, like, where are you from? They find out he's the reason the storm is here. And then he says, I am a Hebrew, and I fear Yahweh, the maker of the sea and the dry land. And you're like, no, you don't actually fear the Lord. You fear something else, because if you actually feared the Lord, you'd be doing what he said. And here it's another misalignment of fear. What is Peter's attention suddenly drawn to? Seeing the wind, he became frightened, and he begins to sink. Just like Jonah, with his fear in the wrong place, Jonah sinks into the waters. Both prophets and messengers of Yahweh sink into the stormy waters of death. But just like Jonah, what does Peter say? He says, Lord, save me. He cries out for rescue. And 31, immediately Jesus stretched out his hand, and he took hold of him, and he said, you of little faith, why did you doubt? And then they got into the boat, and then boom, the wind stopped. And those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, truly, you are the Son of God. And so, both of these stories, we have this pattern of getting onto the waters, storm arises, falling into the waters, and then a moment of request for rescue, and then boom, God responds. And it's kind of in that moment, this is where I was saying this overlap starts to happen of the events of the past week and also the sermon this evening, is whenever someone like steps into these waters, it's like you're sinking down and you're doing what Jonah, doing what Peter did as well. You're crying out like, Lord, save me. And the thing is would God have reached down and rescued Jonah if he hadn't said anything? No. Would God and Jesus, would he have stretched out his hand and picked him up if he hadn't cried out, Lord, save me? Like, it's like in each of these moments, there's a meeting of the divine will and then the human choice. And they touch in this moment. And in that, life, exaltation, and rescue happens. In other words, salvation. And so then, I want to go to like the final example of this kind of theme or pattern of this story, and that is our Lord himself. Turn over to Mark chapter 10. Because like the word of the Lord came to Jonah, and the word came down in the flesh as Jesus. And here in Mark chapter 10, Jesus has a very interesting description of what he's about to go do in that moment of great rescue, which is the cross. And when Jesus, as the word that is embodied, he describes his going to the cross as a being like taken down into the waters of death. Look now in Mark chapter 10, and in this story there's we'll back up and we'll read, kind of give the context as well. Go to verse 35. Start in verse 35. Then James and John, the two sons of Zebedee, came up to Jesus, saying to him, Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask you. Which is kind of an interesting start to a question, right? Like you just ask someone, hey, will you do me a favor? And you're kind of like, what's the favor? And so Jesus says, what do you want me to do for you? And they said to him, grant that we may sit, one on your right and one on your left, in your glory. And Jesus said to him, you do not know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism that I am to be baptized? Then they say to him, we are able. And Jesus said to him, the cup that I drink, you will drink, and you shall be baptized with the baptism with which I am to be baptized. But to sit on my right and on my left, this is not mine to give, but is for those to whom it has been prepared. That phrase, right and left, is very interesting because, and they said right and left when you come into your glory. In all the Gospels, what's portrayed as the moment that God's glory is displayed fully? The cross, when he has one criminal on his right and one on his left. The problem is the disciples don't yet see glory with the eyes of heaven, as they still thinking of glory in a very earthly sense. And so they ask something that they don't even realize that they're asking. And Jesus says, actually, yes, you're going to experience this glory as well. And this is also very curious because if you look up just a few more verses in verse 31, Jesus tells us about how you need to become like children, and he gives a little summary of what this kingdom is like. He says, those who are first will be last, and the last first. James and John, the two sons of Zebedee. First disciple that's martyred, first apostle, that's martyred. Do you know who it is? It's James. Last one, as far as we know by history, that's martyred, John. The first and the last of the ones who share in the glory of Christ in going until death for his glory is these two apostles. It's just a very curious detail there. But Christ in all of these different passages, sorry, I forgot to put that one on the screen there. In Mark 10, Luke 12, and then of course in Romans 6, when what happens with Mike earlier this week, go down into the waters, like we're following him into that death as well, into the waters of death. But then there's, of course, the contrast of all of these stories we've been looking at. The similarities are interesting and the differences. Because while Jonah, we find out the reason he was willing to be thrown into the sea is because he really didn't want to go give the Ninevites their message because he knew God was going to be compassionate to them. Like he says that. He says, I didn't want to give them the message because I knew you were just a dirty, rotten, compassionate God that was going to forgive them of their trespasses. And Jonah was willing to die on the behalf so that many might be condemned. And in the reverse, Jesus is willing to surrender his life and die so that the many might have a chance for rescue. And then, again, parallel to this, turn over to Mark chapter 15. Mark chapter 15. When Jesus is on the cross, there's a strange echo of that story with Peter. Because whenever the mockers see Jesus hanging there, they say, and I'm just going to reference it for now, but they say, if you are the Son of God, come down from there. It's kind of similar to that phrase that Peter said, where he says, if it is you, Lord, like call me out on the waters. But what Jesus is doing is he doesn't give in to their mockery. It's not a disciple or a friend or an apostle that's calling out to him. It's people trying to mock him, trying to get him to not do what he came to do, and try to seek glory in an earthly way. But what glory is the cross. And so then, lastly, the exact same thing that we just saw happen with Jonah, with Peter, also happens with Jesus, is that he was raised up. Turn over to Ephesians. Ephesians chapter 1, and then the lesson will be yours. In Ephesians, I just lost Ephesians 1, everybody. In Ephesians chapter 1, on the flip side, it's like, this is, oh well, the time has come to get a new Bible, I guess. You know, one time someone was like, in the Bible I had before this, it was like really worn out, and they were like, wow, like such a student. And it's like, no, I wish that was, I mean, I do study my Bible, I promise. But it's more of I just kind of need to take better care of my things. And so here Ephesians has been very worn out. But Ephesians chapter 1, let's read, getting back to it, concluding point here. Because Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment of all of these patterns. Like he walked that way perfectly, not like Jonah and resisting, or not like Peter and doubting, but surrendering himself fully unto death and giving his life over on our behalf. Here in Ephesians chapter 1 and verse 19, talking about, Paul's reflecting on this, and he says, what is the surpassing greatness of his power towards us who believe, according to the working of the might of his strength, which he worked in Christ, by raising him from the dead and seating him at his right hand in the heavenly places, far above all rule and authority and power and dominion, and the name above every name which is named, not only in this age, but also in the one that is to come. And he's put all things in subjection under his feet, and gave him to be head over all things to the church, which is his body, the fullness of him who fills all in all. And so kind of bringing it home with these final last points is, in the storms of life, like when Jonah was in that situation, the storm that came up, that was all his fault. Like it was the result of consequences of his own stupid decision-making and not listening to the word of the Lord. In Peter's case, it was a storm of just seemingly by chance. That they went across the sea just like their Lord said, and boom, there's the storm. And it was fearful and it was terrifying, but he was called out on it anyways. And that's just kind of a pattern for life, because in a room this size, I don't know like what storms you might be going through. Consequence of your own decision, or it's just seemingly at random. Just the chaos and darkness of the world is breaching over, and it's terrifying and it's fearful. But in Christ, both of them meet their point. They both overlap. Because when he went to the cross, he could have, it was because of who he was, like in his own actions. Like he knew he could have stopped it. He gave his life on our behalf. But it also was because of all the darkness and evil and corruption of sin that he had no part in. Like he was innocent. And in that moment, he gave himself over, and just like Jonah, just like Peter, and with Christ, like God brings rescue, resurrection, new life, and redemption on the other side. And so, in whichever storm you find yourself in, it's the same solution. Cry out to him. And then, if you're not in him yet, like cry out to him. And it starts right here, descending into those waters. And as Peter describes it, it's an appeal to God for a good conscience, and rising up and walking in newness of life on the other side. And then, as we been kind of as I started the lesson, is it's that fusion of both us and God 100% working together. And that's what the plan has always been and what God has always wanted from the beginning. Those who are made in his image, humans, what he wanted to rule and to reign with in his creation. And now as as Jesus restored that and we enter into it, we become like images of Christ walking around here. And as Paul can say, it's both and. It's not an either or thing, it's both and. Because like Paul says in Galatians, he says, it's no longer I who live, but Christ that lives in me. And he can immediately follow that with, and the life that I live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. And so tonight, wherever this finds you at, whichever storm that we've discussed and talked about, whichever example that is, both find their fulfillment in Christ. Cry out to him and call out to him. Whether that is someone who has not put their trust in him yet and needs to enter into those chaotic waters of darkness and rise up from them and confess him as Lord, like that invitation is open to you. Or if you're someone who's wandered away and the storm that you're in is because of your own mess and your decisions and you're resisting his will and walking away from him, turn back to him tonight